Thank you very much. Very nice to be here, and it's going to be hard to beat yesterday's record, isn't it? I told Shannon that, or I told Amy that she'd really need to have a very large hook to get me off of this podium because I always have a lot to say, as many of you already know. I have two little bits of news to point out first. Yesterday we received news that a multi-authored paper called Restoring Monarch Habitats in the Midwest, All Hands on Deck, has been accepted for publication. So look for that in the future. This is an analysis that's come out of the Fort Collins get-togethers that we've had discussing monarch science. That particular analysis looked at all of the landscape priorities for restoring milkweeds across the country and concluded that we have no choice but to put milkweeds in all the habitats we possibly can, and that means everywhere we possibly can in order to restore the monarch population. The other bit of news is that my team working in Oklahoma planted another 2,500 milkweeds yesterday. So anyway, all right, let's get started here. My particular talk is monarchs and pollinators and much more, of course, and the need for habitat restoration. As you all know from looking at this particular graph yesterday, that monarch numbers have been going down. Of particular interest in this figure is that for the long-term average, it's close to 6 hectares, which is our target for where we want to get to in terms of restoring this population. But the average for the period from 2004 until the present is only 2.34 hectares. That's a signal that we still have a decline. And all the signals are from this year's development of the population is that we're looking at possibly another decline again this next winter from the 2.91 that we had last year. A lot remains to develop. We're seeing some good reports from up north right now. It could be that the population will recover from what has been one of the most extraordinary experiences we've ever had with monarchs and watching them move north this spring. There was a period from the 7th through the 9th of April when the winds came out of the south-southwest, hit northern Oklahoma, and blew monarchs 300 miles in 3 days northward, to the point where they were well ahead of the milkweed, and I was getting pictures of monarchs' eggs on milkweed plants from, say, Nebraska, which had obviously been frozen. Not a good deal. All right, this is a figure that you see frequently, illustrates the migration, the seasonal dynamics. I want to point out one thing because it appears to be a confusing thing in almost all of the literature, and that is that people are reporting that monarchs are moving north for successive generations through the summer, and that's not true. Monarchs only move north in the spring from the overwintering sites up to this area where it's green, and their offspring carry the population to the limits of milkweed in May and early June. After early June, we have, about the 9th of June, we have absolutely no evidence of directional movement. So when you see a website that says that monarchs take 3 or 4 generations, continually move north and then turn around, it's just not right. It's a 2-generation recolonization of the country. All right, the monarch population dynamics are really complicated. And you saw a couple of nice presentations with this kind of a wheel figure showing all of the different generations. But it's more complicated than that wheel because you have, at certain latitudes, maybe 2 or 3 generations functioning at the same time, depending upon where you are on the continent. So you have different periods that we really need to understand across different latitudes. If we're really going to understand the dynamics of this species, we have to break it out and understand what's happening in every section of this annual cycle, plus what's happening at every latitude. That's a tall order, and we're not quite there yet. All right, one of the complicating factors that we need to understand is where the monarchs come from that reach Mexico. So a paper was published in '98 that I had a role in, which showed that the natal origins of monarchs, that is, the birthplaces of the monarchs that reached Mexico, mostly came out of the Midwest in this darkly shaded area here, and with a broader area encompassing almost all of the distribution of monarchs that would be breeding in the summer. This was fine. It looked really good. It's a little bit different from some of the graphics that you saw yesterday, but by and large, what this told us was that monarchs are coming out of this area, which is the Corn Belt. The analysis basically shows that monarchs are competing with corn and soybeans in the upper Midwest for habitat, and that's an issue. So as far as the monarch declines are concerned, and this is what I'm going to talk about first, monarch declines, why are monarchs declining, and then what Monarch Watch is really trying to do about it, and then we'll get to try to understand a little bit about this annual cycle and why the populations fluctuate from year to year. So why are monarchs declining? Well, genetically modified plants, genetically modified corn and soybeans that are resistant to glyphosate and other herbicides now. These are being deployed in a massive way across the continent, with the effect that milkweed, which I have lots of slides of, which used to occur in corn and soybean fields, has been largely eliminated. So then we have the economics of the Renewable Fuel Standard, which was signed in 2007, the end of 2007. This resulted in a massive conversion of rangeland and grassland to croplands for the biofuels to produce ethanol. In other words, what happened was that the price of corn, because of the demand to produce ethanol, went up so sky high that the farmers began to look for every bit of marginal land that they could find in order to produce more corn. So corn production went way up. What happened in the upper Midwest, as I'll show you in another slide, is that the wheat and grains of other sorts were displaced from the Midwest and moved off in the grassland. This resulted in a tremendous loss of grassland. Then we've got development, which probably is in the order of 1 to 2 million acres per year. We have an intensification of agriculture that's a big factor here, and we also have management of marginal lands, which we're using to we're controlling with herbicides and excessive mowing. So we have a number of factors here, including insecticides and degradation of the overwintering sites, and unfavorable conditions during the breeding season, which is this annual variation that I'll get to at the end. And so let's just take a look, and I'm just skimming over the details here. I'm skimming at the top here. There's a lot of detail that I could provide you, but we don't have time for that. Loss of habitat due to the adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops. I'll just show you this one figure. As herbicide-tolerant crops became more adopted and widespread, as we had more GMO corn and soybeans out there and the milkweed began to disappear from the corn and soybean fields, you can see what happened to the population. So the adoption rate is indicated in the dark red line, and the population you can see in the green. And we have a paper that we're working on now which shows that the strongest correlation with the decline of monarch butterflies is the use of glyphosate, is the use of Roundup on these crops. Now let's talk about the loss of habitat associated with the adoption of the Renewable Fuel Standard that, as I said, was signed at the end of 2007. That resulted in this massive change in habitat that resulted in a loss of grassland. So 77.7% of the habitat conversion that followed the adoption of a renewable fuel standard was grassland, 77.7%. Those were lands that were converted into grain crops that were moved out of the Midwest as a result of trying to produce more corn. That's a tremendous change, and it meant that something like almost 24 million acres were converted from one land use type to another in only 4 years. That's an area the size of the state of Indiana. That's a massive landscape change. And it took about 5 years for people to recognize what was actually happening out there. In other words, we were behind the curve. We really didn't understand what was happening across the landscapes of the U.S. All those areas that are in blue are indications of counties in which there was a landscape change, most of that indicating that there was a loss of grassland. So if we sum all of this up, looking at all of this in total, and this is kind of generous, I'll admit, it comes up to an area that's bigger than the size of the state of Texas. The total was 173 million acres of lost habitat since '96. Texas is 171 million acres. That's a lot of habitat. And even if I'm wrong by, say, a factor of 2, it's still a loss of habitat that's of extraordinary importance in maintaining our wildlife out there. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about our tagging program. And we have a lot of people tagging butterflies. We've been doing this since 1992. We have about 1.4 million butterflies tagged over the years. We have about 17,000 recoveries, and we're beginning to analyze all of those data now, and they're telling us a lot. And what we're seeing is patterns that are repeated from year to year and year. And these patterns are telling us a lot about the migration, how the migration works, who gets to Mexico, who doesn't get to Mexico. Don't have time to cover that. But what it does tell us that's relevant today is that over 90% of the monarchs that reach Mexico come out of this area that's etched in red here. So we have 2 areas to be concerned about by and large, and I'll get to that again. One of those is that area etched out in white. That's the early production, first returning monarchs production area. And then we have this summer production area, which generates most of the monarchs that get to Mexico. Now, Kristen is coming up with some data indicating that we got some 5th generation monarchs getting to Mexico, but that number still appears to be quite small relative to all of the tagging base that we have. So what are we doing in terms of our monarch recovery? What is our restoration target? Well, we know the target is 6 hectares of overwintering butterflies, but what does that mean in terms of acres? What does that mean in terms of plants? Do we really have a plan, and do we have a comprehensive national plan? I would have to say that the answer to that is no, but that's what we're all struggling with. That's what all these state meetings are about. That's what the regional meeting was about. That's what this meeting is about, in a sense, is we have to have some sort of coordinated plan to go forward in this. And so will those efforts be coordinated? And I think this is where we still have some open questions, but it looks like we're moving in that direction. And where are we going to plant those milkweeds? Is it going to be on this milkweed monarch corridor that I illustrated in a previous slide? Is it going to be along I-35 and so on? And the plants, what milkweeds we're going to use, what nectar sources are we going to provide, and where are we going to put them? Are we going to do this with plant plugs like we're doing in Oklahoma, or are we going to do this with seeding? And then, do we have the capacity to do this? And yesterday we heard some talks about seed production and so on and so forth, and the difficulty of producing a lot of seeds for a market like this. And it appears that we're going to have some problems. We have some problems in capacity issues. One of the problems I'm dealing with in Oklahoma is that there is no real seed bank or seed availability for the restoration we want to do with Oklahoma, so we're doing everything with plugs. Then we have an implementation issue, and that implementation issue is, the teamwork, the understanding, the knowledge, and then the restoration costs that go along with all of that. So we want to target these 2 areas, as I pointed out before. I could give you more detail here, but let's just move on. I think you understand the concept here. And the baseline values that we're talking about here is we don't understand how many monarchs there are per hectare down in Mexico. It's estimated to be somewhere between 15 and 40 million monarchs per hectare. We know from estimates that have been generated up in Minnesota and Iowa that it takes somewhere between 12 and 30 milkweed stems to produce a monarch that reaches Mexico. And thank you, Amy. And so that gives us a target. And we have at present about enough milkweed out there to produce a population, overwintering population, between 3.5 to 4.5 hectares, with a goal of reaching 6. The stems needed are going to be between 1.4 and 2 billion stems. So that's going to be tough. What are we going to do? We got to put this milkweed out here in the south. This is Asclepias viridis. This is the 2nd most important plant for monarchs in the country. This is probably the 1st most important plant in the country. That's in the northern region. This is common milkweed. And let me just tell you a little bit about our program here. I don't have enough time to cover all of this, but we started a way station program in 2005. We have something like about 16,000 registered sites. A lot of those are in homes, some of them are in schools. We're distributed over 49 states and DC and 6 Canadian provinces and a few other places. The idea was to get homeowners to compensate for some of the habitat loss. At the time I started this, Monarch Watch was just basically teetering on the brink of extinction, so we didn't get a lot of publicity on this. Later on, and that shows you the distribution of our monarch way stations, which are mostly urban. Later on, I started this Bring Back the Monarchs program, and the idea of this program is to restore 20 different milkweed species across the landscape to the habitats from which the seeds are obtained. To do this, I had to engage a number of nurseries. I worked with nurseries in Kansas and Oklahoma and Florida and California, producing tens of thousands of milkweeds. And as Shannon said earlier, last year we distributed 206,000 plugs through these partner nurseries. The other thing that to bring your attention to is in 2015 I wrote a white paper concerning the creation of a Monarch Highway, the I-35 corridor. The idea of this was to draw attention to the importance of getting a message out to the public. So here's the message here. Creating the Monarch Highway will strongly communicate the need to maintain the integrity of the system that supports monarchs, pollinators, and other species sharing these habitats. So the restoration of milkweeds and native plants on tribal lands, which was mentioned yesterday, these are the tribes that I'm working with in Oklahoma. Last year we got 15,000 plugs in the ground. This year we're going to get another 20,000 plugs in the ground. These are all milkweed plugs. And each of the tribes is learning to grow native plants, and so that they can get another 4,000 native plants in the ground this year. And this shows the procedure here. We have a concept here of creating habitat islands. The idea is to create an island where we have very dense vegetation that kind of looks like this. This is outside the governor's mansion in Kansas. This dense vegetation, once it reaches this point and comes into seed in the fall, is then mowed down, and so the seeds are spread across a larger landscape. So we're using these habitat islands as a way of seeding in large-scale restoration over larger habitats. So let's talk about interannual variation here. There's a lot of confusion about this. You see these numbers go up and down. We're getting very close to understanding this. I've summarized here my basic understanding of it. The number and reproductive success of monarchs reaching Texas and Oklahoma in the previous spring really largely determines what happens at the overwintering sites. The number and timing of first-generation monarchs moving north, which is happening right now, is really important. And so we're very closely tracking what's happening as monarchs are moving north. And then summer temperatures also play a role. So this interannual variation is a response to climatic conditions. Nothing more, nothing less than that. It's nothing to really get excited about. What is to get excited about and worry about are these catastrophic bouts of mortality that sometimes occur at the overwintering sites that drive all the rest of that. So finishing up, and I am finished, Amy. Finishing up, it's all about monarchs, but no, it's about all sorts of things out there that share the same habitats. As we've said repeatedly, monarchs are really a flagship for what is going on a large basis on this larger landscape. And if you are really concerned about monarchs, think again about grassland birds. Grassland birds are even falling faster than monarchs are. They're not as affected by the weather conditions, and their downward slope is really, really dramatic as well. But they don't get the attention that monarchs do. Well, with that, that's all that Toto and I have to say from Kansas. Thank you very much.